Welcome to Kyiv and welcome to Ukraine. Welcome to Militarny.
Thank you so much.
And we will talk about war now, about Ukrainian war and about Ukrainian pilots and aircrafts. So, how you describe the situation on the battlefield now in Ukraine, and what does about political situation, and how does the situation on battlefield affect it?
There's a lot of questions in there.
Yep, it's true.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's my first time in Ukraine, and it's such a beautiful country. I spent one day across in Lviv, and now will spend 2 days in Kyiv. And the sunshine has come down, and in the west, we imagine that Kyiv is rubble. It's been blown up. Walking around your beautiful city, there's no sign to my eyes, but every now and again you come across a memorial, and I spent some time this morning at the memorial with the flags for the fallen soldiers. In answering your question, it's very difficult from somebody outside the country. All I can do is give a picture of how the West sees what's happening. You will have a much better idea in the country. And the reason it's important is because the West provides weapons and money, which is valuable to Ukraine if they are to prevail in this conflict. So it is important how the West sees it. But I look forward to you telling me.
That's why I ask you.
No. But you'll correct me. I just want. I think what we don't know is what President Putin's ambitions are. You may have a different idea, but it looks like now that they are secure the Donbass, the Crimea and Peninsula, and obviously Sevastopol, and the bridge of land between the two. And it feels like that Russia is pushing hard to take that before the winter this year. The $60 billion of aid that the US was going to provide was delayed, and Russia took advantage and pushed. Now, Ukraine is doing an amazing job of slowing that advance down, but Russia is advancing. The question is they're losing a lot of soldiers, and for all sorts of reasons, Russia might not want to mobilize again very soon, and therefore it doesn't seem sustainable. Therefore, it seems likely Russia's pushing in order that it can pause, maybe with a new American president in, and say, right, President Trump thinks this will all be over in 24 hours, and it looks like that's what Putin is doing. What I don't think anybody quite knew was when the Kursk incursion happened, but whether that is a strategic success or not, that's difficult. We can talk about that if you like. So I think the battlefield situation, one other thing, the West has been slow to support, but it has supported. At the start of the war, Ukraine was not in NATO. Ukraine is another country, and we have lots of financial problems ourselves. But the West and my country has, with anti-tank weapons, then providing tanks. We were the first to provide tanks, which opened the door for other countries to do that. Long-range weapons, so Storm Shadow, and then F-16 fighter jets. There's a lot of training going on in my country, both for pilots but also your soldiers. But inevitably, there are questions because we are now approaching 1,000 days since the war started. And inevitably, there are people in our country and in America who are saying, how long is this going to go on for? How much money? Now, that's why I came here, because I wanted to talk, and I've had some really powerful discussions with people here who have shown a different perspective on how the people feel. 300 years we've been fighting the Russians, So it's a long answer, but it's a massive question. I'm sure you'll want to pick me apart.
Of course, in this case, how are NATO's red lines for Putin? What line he can't cross? And he know about this or not? But it looks like not.
Sorry, when you say NATO red lines, or do you mean?
I mean NATO, I mean European, British, American, give the huge message that he knows that he can't cross some lines.
Yes, so the big advantage that Russia has is that it's one person. Putin wakes up in the morning and decides what he wants to do. NATO, 32 countries. Not one of those countries can stand up on their own and say, this is a red line. They have to talk about it. And the weakness of alliance is that you are only as effective as your weakest link. A good example of that is that my country gave Storm Shadow missiles to President Zelensky and said, as long as you use these within the law of armed conflict, that there are no restrictions. America had a different view. When Ukraine started moving into Russian territory, which is now crosses one of Putin's red lines, he didn't do anything, the West, America, said, we are an alliance, NATO, of 32 countries. We can't have one country doing one thing and one country doing another. We need to be more coherent about our approach. And the difficulty there, I suspect, is actually because it's a political year. There's an election going on, and both Trump and Biden, Kamala Harris, have slightly different views about the support for Ukraine. And until that election is done and we have much more clarity, I think that the gloves will come off more again. But until that point, one of the weaknesses is we live in a democracy. And I think that's why we're seeing some of this difficulty now.
But it looks like he can do everything with us.
Yeah. So, again, from a military perspective, not a political perspective, if I was a Russian planner, I would know that if the West was to get involved in the war, Russia would lose. They have no answer. When I joined the Royal Air Force as a fighter pilot last century, we were fighting the Cold War. We thought then the Soviet Union had some very impressive aircraft and capability. What has happened in the war is that it's shown that Russia's air force is not very good at all. Ukraine has done an amazing job with very, very limited resources to hold them at bay. Likewise with the Russian Navy. You've managed to push it to the east. And therefore, if the West was worried about Russia before, now I know my Air Force colleagues would love to have a go and support, because they now know just how weak Russia is. But inevitably, Russia is a nuclear power, and Ukraine isn't a member of NATO. The thing that I think I find, talking to some of your Ukrainian colleagues, I use 1994 and the Budapest Memo as one of the points in history. Many of your colleagues, your country folk here, look at it in a very different way. I've been told by several people, quite angry, we were forced into signing that by the West. We were forced into signing it because they said we would be safe if we gave up our nuclear weapons. And yet 20 years later, Putin ripped that up. And America, the UK, you didn't come and help. And therefore, why would we accept any peace from Putin? Because it won't last. So I do think there's some really interesting dynamics around this. In terms of red lines, it's not a NATO war, it's a Ukrainian war, but the West has been trying to support. In my view, I think the time for the West to put a no-fly zone over at least part of Ukraine is something that was not even remotely an idea at the start of the war. Now seems to be, there is a more of a conversation. But every part of that conversation is getting the West deeper and deeper into this war. And you will probably believe it is our war. Our political masters are not there yet.
In this case, you said about the Cold War. Those years, NATO preparing for a real war with Soviet Union or no? And is NATO now considering the possibility of war with Russia, a real war?
Yes, so that's again, you will see this from a different perspective than the West does. So it's important to, when I was in the Royal Air Force, one of my tours was in the Ministry of Defence in London. That's the strategic headquarters where you decide where the major threats occur, what your role as a nation is in addressing those threats, how much money that is going to cost, and how much money, therefore, we need from our government in order to meet those threats. The two main threats we had were Russia and China. China, I'm talking big handfuls. China, Americans could sort that out. Russia, because its threat was on the European continent, that was a Europe challenge, and therefore it was our challenge as well. At that time, we ran all sorts of simulations to see what capability Russia had, how many tanks they had, how many aircraft they had, what we would need to fight them. And that really defined how our military is set up today. What has happened in the last 2.5 years is Russia has, because of Ukraine's defenses, has lost a lot of its equipment. Most of its modern tanks, they're now bringing tanks out from the Second World War era. So my point being is that is the threat to my country the same as it was before the war? The answer is no. Russia does not present a threat to Europe anymore because even if it wanted to, it doesn't have the equipment. And if it struggled to achieve what it wanted to in Ukraine, many of the Western nations, NATO nations, are much better equipped than Ukraine was, and therefore Russia would know that even if it was at full strength, it would struggle. Now, weakened tremendously, it would not have a chance. So the point is, my country now feels safer, not more threatened, because of the war in Ukraine.
But we read in news that different countries in Europe have some problems with their armies, not enough soldiers, not enough equipment, something sent to Ukraine. And how do you think the European defense industry ready for war if it's happened? I mean, not American, but rather European.
Well, there's two questions in there, I think. The one of them is about how many soldiers. In history, no country has enough soldiers fully trained to go to war. Ukraine didn't, Russia didn't. You have to mobilize and you have to. But all of that is around a central core of professional military. In my country, we spent 20 years in Afghanistan, and you would imagine that that was a war where we lost nothing like you've lost, but we lost a lot of soldiers, a lot injured. We had no problems recruiting soldiers at all. Why? Young men, maybe young women, but young men particularly, joined because they were ready to go to war. When we are not at war, our military struggle to recruit soldiers because they join, and what do? Lots of exercise, but they joined to go and on big adventures. So Europe has not seen war for 30 years. Europe, at the end of the Cold War, we halved our spending on defense. We had wars of choice, so we decided we'll get involved in Afghanistan and other countries, but largely where we didn't really need big armies. We were using our weapons and technology to prevail. The shock for the West and Europe now is that we thought, not we, the politicians thought that the days of war were over. Nobody would be so stupid to invade another country.
We know one man.
Correct. And therefore, we were investing heavily in weapons. So, although much of Europe doesn't have a big army, in times of need, that's when you do get a lot of people in. The second part of the question is about weapons, though, and I think that, for me, is most interesting. My country, at the end of the Second World War, when millions of people died, millions, we never wanted to see on the battlefield two big armies come together and just wars of attrition, we called it. It was like medieval. We'll meet you on the fields of battle, we'll have a cup of tea, and then we'll just fight each other and see who's left standing. So we decided to invest in technology, precision weapons. Now, for some, that isn't warfare. But if you go back in history, the first time somebody invented a bow and arrow, that was considered cheating. Because you're not coming and fighting me, you're killing me at a distance. But actually, that's the way warfare has gone. The problem with technology is it's very expensive, so you can't afford much of it. And in my country, we looked at some of the wars we might need to fight. So would we need to fight a big war? No. Would we be part of an alliance with other countries? Yes. Therefore, how many weapons would we need to make that happen? That number was still far too big, and the cost was very big. So we took risk by just not investing as much. Then a war comes like this, and you need bullets, you need artillery shells. We weren't really using those anymore, but we had some stockpiles, but you were using a different size of barrel than we were, so we had to give you the artillery pieces. But the more importantly, it was the technology, it was air defense systems. They're expensive, but they're technology. Long-range missiles, drones, lots of different capabilities. And we were happy to support, but we didn't have many of them. And I think Storm Shadow is a really good example because it's a weapon that Ukraine has used very effectively. We bought 1,000 Storm Shadow missiles 30 years ago. The companies that made them shut down, and we had 1,000. We used about 200 in the last 30 years on operations. So we had about 800 left. We decided to upgrade them because they were all getting a bit old, but we were only going to upgrade 300 of them. So that left about 500 missiles. So when President Zelensky wanted long-range missiles, there you go. We weren't worried about the technology falling into Russian hands because it was 30 years old and we were already upgrading. But once those missiles run out, you can't go down to the local shops and buy a few more. They just don't exist. Our mobile phones, if I asked you, right, I want a 30-year-old mobile phone now, where would you get them from? You can't make them. The technology isn't around anymore. And I think the real problem for the West is that we've lived for 30 years without a threat of war. Suddenly, one man decides to start a war. And we haven't got a way of quickly generating these weapons that we know are so effective quickly. And that is the problem that we're wrestling with in the West at the moment.
It's happened. You see this process when factories try to do more weapon.
I do, but I think what's happened is that it's not quite as simple as that, because our country could give you modern air defense weapons where the factories are still going. But we are very worried that that technology would find its way into Russian hands. And our advantage is we don't show what we can do, and therefore the enemy is never quite sure what our capability is. Russia has been using hypersonic missiles. We're the only country that's got them. They're not the only country that's got them, but the West doesn't show them around. It saves them for the day. If you remember in the Iraq War, the F-117 was a new stealth fighter. It had been around for 10 years. Nobody had seen it, but it went to war and nobody knew the answer to how to shoot it down. That's what the West uses. It keeps secrets. And therefore, it doesn't want to give the most modern weapons. But if you ask a company to build older weapons, there's not the technology to do that. So one of the best ways that I've seen that the West is solving this is that if I wanted to build a drone to deliver to Ukraine, designing it and building it isn't very simple. The long time takes for safety checks and making sure that it's safe to operate, that the risk analysis has been done. That takes months, sometimes years. But if I give you the technology and I give you the component parts, you can put them together. Do you worry about the risk? Do you worry about flying it lots of times to make sure it's safe? You don't. You just want to use it. So you can get weapons very much quicker if we provide the technology and the components rather than simply getting the weapons. Because the weapons themselves, we don't have them. If we build them, it's going to take a long time. And we have all this political agenda of why can't we use these long-range weapons? Russia then says we're going to have nuclear war. So let's not provide the weapons. Let's give you the
technology
and let you bolt them together, and it avoids some of the political sensitivities. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Ukraine has apparently tested a ballistic missile. Fantastic. Also long-range drones. Now, I don't want to know about the program, but as a military guy, I can see that Ukraine has been a lot more effective at hitting targets deep within Russia. That's not a coincidence.
And United Kingdom and Ukraine work in such way with technologies. We know about this. It's very cool, and I think this will have some good result for Russia. So now about aircrafts and about F-16s for Ukraine. So currently Ukrainian pilots are undergoing training in Great Britain. It's basic training. What does it consist of, and what next? What next step for them?
Yeah, so it's probably worth setting a bit of context here. As a former fighter pilot, it made me laugh when people said we must give F-16s to Ukraine. I could give 100 F-16s to you today. What would you do with them?
Look.
Yeah, because most people could fly them up, down, left, right, faster, slower. Every aeroplane. But the F-16 is a very expensive, very complex piece of equipment, and it takes years not to learn how to operate it, but to know how to manage it in a very difficult environment. We choose the best of the best to fly these jets, and even then, once they've got to the front line, they're like a 17-year-old who's just passed his driving test. They're a danger in the skies, and it takes 3 years before they're really qualified. So simply giving a load of F-16s to Ukraine would not be the answer. You had to get engineers trained, you need to have the weapons, you need to get the technology, but most importantly, how are you going to get the pilots? So my understanding at the start of this was that when the war is ending, somehow Ukraine will need to be able to defend itself, will need to have a credible air power capability. And how was the West going to help Ukraine do that? The pilots was the most difficult thing. Right, let's start training your pilots now, because when the war is over, at least we have fed the pipeline and you will be able to operate these aeroplanes. I don't think originally there was any intention these F-16s being used in the war today. But as the war has gone on and President Zelensky has appealed, the West has said, okay, let's put some F-16s forward and let's train some of your pilots. But I avoid getting involved in how many pilots and the numbers, but let's say it's a small number of F-16s that you're actually operating, and we've lost one already. And that is part of, it's a really difficult environment to operate where a pilot needs to be very closely coordinated with everything on the ground. When I flew in the Iraq war, we were most worried not about the Iraqi air defense systems on the Iraqi missiles. We were worried when we came home that the American Patriot system would shoot us down. That's true. We were most worried about our own systems because it's a very dynamic environment and you need very, very good training to make sure that the young operator of your Patriot doesn't see a 600-mile-an-hour jet, press the button and then go, ooh. My point being is that this is a lot more than simply just about the aircraft. So back to your question, the pilot training, we have the oldest central flying school in the world in the UK. But what we are trying to do with your Ukrainian pilots, we don't select them. In the UK, we have a very, very mature selection process. We understand the skills that you need, and because pilot training costs a lot of money. And you don't want people failing because they've used a slot that somebody else could use. We also have male and female pilots because we recognize that there's no reason why women can't be as good at this as men. My understanding is that there are no female Ukrainian pilots yet. So we don't select, Ukraine does that. The flying training, the biggest part of it is English language training. Why? Your English is excellent. But why do you need English language in the cockpit of a jet? You need it because it's not about flying your jet. It's where your jet sits with the other jets. It's where your jet is listening to the airborne early warning aircraft that is looking across the whole battlefield, that is seeing the threat aircraft and telling you where they are. It is listening to controllers, air-to-air refueling, and that's all coming through different radios. They're talking to you at the same time, and not all of it's very clear. All of this. So having a very good control of the English language so that you can build, we call it situational awareness. It's not what's happening in your cockpit, it's your place in the big battle space. And that is probably the most difficult thing that a pilot has to do. And if you don't understand the language that that's being done in, you have no hope of understanding that. And if you don't understand that, you don't know where the enemy is, you don't know where the friendly forces are, and you are a danger to yourself. So helping these pilots who, they just want to get through training and get to the front line and help their colleagues on the battlefield, but we're having to slow them down to say, if you don't understand the English language, I know it doesn't, sitting in a classroom in England learning English, I want to be flying the aircraft. I know, but you've got to get this right first. So it's a very slow process for the English language, frustrating for the young pilots. When they get to the actual flying bit, they're very good. They are working hard. When I went through flying training, you were distracted with having a beer, meeting girls, enjoying yourself. These Ukrainian pilots, they are focused. They are working very hard. They do simulators. So it's not all about just flying, because you learn a lot in a simulator to make sure that you every moment in the air is maximum value. And they are working morning, noon, and night to be as quick as they can through that process. And it's a huge privilege to watch. The challenge, of course, is that where we only have a pipeline that can train so many pilots, so the more Ukrainian pilots we train, the fewer of British pilots can we train. And that's putting us short of pilots at the moment. But that's a sacrifice that we're prepared to make. And then they go on to learn how to fly the F-16. Then they go to operate the F-16, and then they get released to their squadron. But as we found with the most recent loss of Moonfish, it takes years to train a pilot. They go in a fraction of a second. So we have to make sure that they're as well trained as possible. Otherwise, we've just wasted not just a life, but also a unique part of Ukraine's military capability.
After this basic training, what the next step? Because Great Britain use Typhoons and F-35. Ukraine, now we talk about F-16, maybe some other aircrafts. What the next step? How this studying for real aircrafts?
So I've deliberately tried to get involved in the European side of this, but I've not been able to get access to it. What's interesting is I find myself, I'm looked at as a Sky News expert, but I'm not employed by Sky News. I've never been a reporter. I've never worked in the business. 2.5 years ago, when the war started, the then boss of Sky News wanted to have a correspondent on the ground and wanted to have somebody in the studio that could make sense of what was happening. And they brought about 30 people in, some of them journalists, some of them presenters. They tended to be very good in front of the camera, but didn't know much about defense. A lot of military guys knew a lot about defense, but weren't very good in front of the camera. And so two of us, Michael Clark and myself, ended up doing it. And I've still got a proper job, but this is just what I do to try to help out. As a result, I've ended up trying to focus purely on the military side of things. But inevitably, things like the pilot training in Europe, I say, I'm a pilot. I'm a former jet pilot. Trust me, I still hold my security clearances. But you can see them looking and going, you're a journalist, you know. But I think the point is that our training, you can't just put somebody in an F-16 and teach them to fly. If they make a mistake, it's an expensive mistake. And you've got to do building blocks approach, teach them how to fly, because it's not how to deal with weather, how to deal with lack of fuel, how to deal with emergencies, how to operate with other aircraft, air traffic control, just landing safely. So we do a building blocks, use cheaper aeroplanes that only cost £1,000 an hour, whereas an F-16 will often cost £50,000 an hour. It's not actually that, but it's a lot of money each hour because of all of the support that has to be around it. In our military, from the day you start flying to the day you get combat ready is about 4 years. So for the new recruits that have never flown before, it will be a long time before they end up arriving in Ukraine as a fully effective combat ready pilot. What we're also doing, though, is converting some of your MiG-29 pilots to fly the F-16. They already have a lot of experience, but they don't know how to operate a fighter jet. And just one example of the challenge, just one example. Typewriter keyboards, depending on your language, but the keyboard is laid out much the same way. In the cockpit, we have what's called hand on throttle and stick. You don't want the pilot to let go of the throttle or the stick. So on the throttle and on the stick, there are lots of buttons. On the Harrier, which I used to fly, the button at the top, operated by your thumb, could go forward, backwards, left or right or down, or double back, or double forward. Just one thing on your thumb. Every one of your fingers had different things. Everybody who's flown a different aeroplane, like the MiG-29, will never have had, so they've got to, it's like a new typewriter keyboard that everybody's just moved all the pieces around, and you've got to work out where they all are. That's one of the challenges of operating a brand new aeroplane, and that's the value of simulators, because you can sit in your room and learn how to use those functions, but when you can do it in the peacetime environment, in the privacy of your room, trust me, when you're flying and your heart is pounding and everything's going on around you, all of this has to be natural, it has to be intuitive. You can't think about it, you've got no spare capacity to think about it. So it will probably take 3 or 4 months to get the MiG-29 pilots adapted, and even then, they will not be very good because they just don't have the experience of operating that sort of aircraft. The F-16 has a very good radar, a very good electronic warfare capability, very good countermeasures capability, flares and chaff, stuff like that. But you have to learn how to use them. And that is the huge challenge if you don't want to waste your pilot and the aircraft.
It's a very good example how to describe the difficulties of studying, because I don't think that a lot of Ukrainian people understand how it's hard, because it's really hard, and it's from this training, it's a life of the pilot. This training is the life of the pilot. It's very important.
Yeah, and throughout our training system, when I went through pilot training, we lost a few people who died during that because it's dangerous. If you get it wrong, we talk about capacity. I don't know if you remember when you're learning to drive, your concentration isn't outside the car, it's which pedal do I press, and then well, the other side for you, which pedals, and how do I do this? Now when you drive, you don't think about that. You can be talking and it all happens
automatically.
Automatically. You have to get the flying skills automatically, because the flying of the aeroplane is not the issue. The issue is operating the aeroplane, thinking outside the aircraft, feeling the sounds, listening for certain things, doing certain things intuitively. That's what makes a good pilot, and that takes years of training.
Ukrainian pilots who currently use F-16s, they studied for 9 months. Only 9 months. What percentage can they use potential of F-16? How do you think?
It's difficult because it does depend on the pilot. So, for example, they have already been experienced pilots. They've had to learn how to fly a different aircraft. The longest time I spent, so when you join the military as a pilot, you join the front line, you do a couple of tours, then you do a ground tour, so you go and do a staff job, and then you come back to flying. So you spend time away from the cockpit, growing your experience of defence. So the more senior in rank you get, the less flying you do along the way. And I think the longest time I had away from the cockpit was about 6 years. And I went back to fly the Harrier again. This time I was commanding the force. And I thought, I wonder how quickly, how much do you forget and how much do you remember? And what was fascinating was that you get in the cockpit and it immediately feels familiar. And actually, when you're physically flying it around the circuit your hands are going to the right place, but you're looking at them going, what are you doing over there? Because your body knows what to do. I'm learning the piano at the moment. I'm not very good. But in the middle of a piece, sometimes you can sit back and watch your hands playing the piano, and they're doing it by themselves. Those skills never leave you. It's like riding a bike or whatever. The skills that leave you are all the emergency skills, how to operate everything. And going back into flying took me about 6 months to get myself fully up to speed. I think for your MiG pilots, it depends how much training they have. And I would not underestimate the valuable role of simulators. And the way to build your experience is in a simulator. I have died many times in a simulator. I have made a lot of mistakes in a simulator. But that's the place to make mistakes, not in the real world. And that is where that most of the value. So some pilots are very, very quick. Some people are very focused. Some people naturally pick these things up quickly. Some people will be older, some people will be younger. The younger tend to be more confident, but not so experienced. The olders tend to not pick up the skills so quickly, but they've got a lot of experience behind them. I remember when I was back on my last flying tour, so I was one of the oldest, and the young pups would come up on a Friday afternoon, and because I wasn't flying very often, I was too busy working, and they'd challenge you to air combat, an aerial duel, and it was take the old man up and kick him around the skies a bit. And it was so funny because they had all the enthusiasm of youth, but you had years of experience. And you would watch what they were doing. You knew what they were going to do next, and you'd do something that countered them. And you would kick them around the skies. And they would get down on the ground afterwards and just look like this. It's very difficult to put a value on experience. And that's one of the challenges. When you ask a question like how long, how quickly, it really does depend. Sometimes the older pilots, the young pilots will think they've got it all. They don't. It's a blend of experience, enthusiasm, professionalism, natural talent. And I can't speak for your pilots, but they are doing an amazing job. They've impressed their instructors in the West. They've impressed the F-16 operators because they're so determined to be as good as they can be, as quickly as they can be, and that bodes well for their futures.
According to existing agreement, Ukraine should receive about 80 F-16s. President Zelensky say we need more. How do you think how more F-16s we need, and how they change the battlefield on the ground and in the sky?
Yeah, so if you do the maths on this, in order for Ukraine to have a credible combat air capability, I think you need almost 200 F-16s. If you look at the role, the job, you'd need about 200. And while there may be better aircraft than the F-16 that might be available to Ukraine, the advantage of the F-16 is it's the most widely sold fighter jet in the world. It's been around for a long time. There are lots of nations like the Dutch, like the Danish, who are moving on to F-35, and therefore there are a lot of F-16s available. And I think that there's been about 80-something that have been pledged, but I think there's about 120 that are believed to be available. But the actual answer, I think, is nearly 200. If you look at, if you had 200, how many pilots do you need? Generally speaking, you have 2 pilots for every 1 aircraft. So you need 400 Ukrainian fighter pilots. Where are they going to come from?
I don't know.
No, so you have...
Maybe some American pilots help us.
Right, that's a different... Let's come on to that. Let's start with Ukrainian-only pilots. I don't want to know the numbers, but you don't have many fighter pilots. And even if all of them stopped flying your MiGs and all of them went through a 6-month program, so you had no Air Force, you can't do that. You still wouldn't have enough pilots to man more than maybe 20 F-16s. So the only way to deliver 200 F-16s, 400 pilots, is to start a training program to get them through. No Air Force in the world has enough spare capacity to let you have 400 people going through your training system. That doesn't exist. And if you suddenly went out and just found 400 people to put through, they would not be the right caliber. You'd be wasting our time and your time. So the answer is that it will take at least 10 years before you can get anywhere close to having the number of pilots you need to man those aircraft. So, while talk of I need 200 aircraft, I understand that, you don't need 200 aircraft today. Wouldn't know what to do with them. And the danger is that you actually therefore use them as disposable assets and hope that the pilots will be able to eject out of them, land, like it happened in World War II in the Battle of Britain. Pilot would bail out, land, give him a cup of tea, get into the next aircraft, off you go. These aircraft are too expensive, too complicated to do that. The only other answer is that you bring in pilots from overseas who are happy to fly those jets for you. There are a lot of retired F-16 pilots around. America has been very clear that if an American pilot flies in an F-16 that we've donated, then that will be seen by Russia as an American combatant, and they can't let that happen. So they've said, you can't do it. But I'm not here to pass judgment. There are a lot of countries that operated F-16s. There are a lot of people who have a lot of sympathy with what Ukraine's going through. I'm an example of that coming to the country in my small way. Maybe that is the answer, that there are some people that can help you. But long term, that's not the answer. The answer is to develop your own. And that's not going to happen this side of 10 years' time. I'm sorry to be the bearer of that, but that's just the facts of life.
But not only about pilots, ground infrastructure is important too,
Oh, exactly.
of course, and engineers.
Absolutely right. I mean, you're quite right to bring that up. When I ran part of our military force in the UK, at the airfield, we had 40 pilots, but there were 2,500 people on the airbase, whether it's air traffic controllers, engineers, armament specialists. There's a lot of safety equipment personnel. There's a lot of people in the team. But my point is, many of those, the training is a lot shorter than it is for the pilot. As a result, doing engineering training, particularly things like an F-16, modern Western aircraft, we call them black boxes. You just literally take one box out and put another box in. Even I could do that. I'll get abused for that. But I'm being trivializing. But it's not like when I used to work on my car, you could take the carburetor apart, you could take the engine apart. These days, when you look in the bonnet of the car...
And black box?
Yeah. So you have to take it to the garage and a black box replacing. Technology means that the F-16, most of the items are not things that the ground crew can repair. They take that one out, put a new one in, send that one back to be replaced. So it's a vital role. The whole team has to be trained, but you'll generally be able to train your people quicker for that than you will be for the pilots. And also, bluntly, the engineers don't generally go to put their lives on the line. They will be targets, but you spend a lot of time and effort training this pilot. You put him into, and he's a target. As soon as he gets in that cockpit, he's a high-value target that everybody on the Russian battlefield will be wanting to kill. So you've got to be really careful to make sure he's properly trained, and also be really careful to make sure he's got the best equipment and understanding of how to use it, because he is a very, very precious asset. Very precious.
Now we talk not only about F-16s, about Gripens, Mirage, maybe Typhoons. How do you think it's possible to have a lot of different aircrafts?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of questions in there, I think, but one of the main ones is that we've just talked about the F-16.
How it's difficult.
Because you just haven't got the pilots. If you now bring another different fighter in, for every different fighter you bring in, you need a different set of engineers, you need a different set of radar operators, a different set of specialists, a different line of spare support. In our military, we got rid of our Harrier because it was a very good aeroplane, but if you have Harrier, F-35 and Typhoon, you've got 3 different sets of flying training, 3 different conversion units, far more expensive. So it makes sense to only have one type of aircraft. And if you're going to have one type of aircraft, use the one that's most widely available. There are other aircraft like the Gripen that are very capable aeroplanes. But that's not the issue here. The issue is about numbers and about focusing how do you maximize those numbers. It's not for me to judge. A good example, though, might be that when the tank situation, the Brits, most of West was a bit reluctant to send tanks to Ukraine. We made the offer of Challenger 2 tanks. I think we only provided 12 or 14 tanks. That's not enough to do anything with. That wasn't the point. The point was it unlocked the door for other nations. And when you look at what's the most widely used tank in Europe, it was Leopard 2. Is it the best tank? Not necessarily. But now you can provide one tank with one set of ammunition. The Challenger 2 has its own set of ammunition. It has a specific ammunition. That would be a nightmare to provide different sets, because you'd have the tank, but you wouldn't have the ammunition. So by providing the Leopard 2 and some American Abrams tanks, you had 2 tanks, which wasn't very useful because you also had your own tanks, but at least you had some modern capability. But it's not just about numbers, it's also about having one type. And in the world of flying, if I gave you a load of F-16s and Typhoons and others, you would not know what to do with them. The easiest way to get you combat air capability is to make sure you've already got more aircraft than you can fly with the F-16 offer. Let's sort out the real problem here, which is to get the pilots through the training system.
A lot of work.
A lot of work, yes.
And last question. Ukrainian engineers were able to combine Storm Shadow missile and Su-24 aircraft, and the result is amazing.
Yes.
You say that. And now we discuss in Ukraine, it's possible to combine Meteor missile with F-16s. How do you think it's possible or not? And this is a task for engineers or for politics who need to say yes for European missile and American aircraft.
Yes, right. It's a good question. Let me answer. There's a couple of parts. First of all, to integrate a new missile onto another aircraft, if I wanted to put a new missile onto the F-35, it will probably take about 5 years to do that, because of all the design work, the aerodynamic testing, flight testing. Every time you put something on the wings of an aircraft, it operates differently, and the balance, the aerodynamics, it affects the aerodynamics over the wing. Therefore, it has performance and handling characteristics that have to be, and that takes a long time. We said earlier, one of the things about when you're at war is you're not that worried about doing all of the safety stuff. You'll carry some risk. And the Storm Shadow is a very big weapon, very heavy. It's almost like you are sat on the missile rather than the missile is strapped to the aircraft. But because of the excellent work of the engineers, but also Ukraine's ability to take a lot of risk, that process happened very quickly and with very good results, I understand. But none of that really happened in the media. That happened away from the eyes of the media, because if you're the company, MBDA, that makes the Storm Shadow missile, and the missile blows up under one of your Su-24s and kills the pilot, that reflects badly on the company that made the missile. The fact that it wasn't properly integrated and that not all the safety checks were done, that will be something that the company is very worried about its reputation. So it's something that's better not done in the glare of the media, because a grown-up conversation around a table, I'm MBDA, you're President Zelensky, I say there's a risk it could blow up. You say, I don't care. Well, it might not operate quite right at supersonic speeds. I don't care. But it might take us a while to do this. I don't care. I just want it on there as fast as you can. And as long as the customer has that agreement, the West will lean into it. What it doesn't want to do is have that conversation played out in a broader context. And I think Meteor is a really good example of any weapon can be integrated onto an older aircraft. The F-16, the people who designed the F-16, Lockheed Martin, will have a view about how it can be done. The people who make the missiles will have a view. The beauty of it is that all of the parties will be going, what do we have to do to make it happen? But the one big thing that we have to be very careful of is that the technology in Meteor, will the West be happy for that technology to be given to Ukraine? Meteor is a very, very effective weapon, and there will, I'm not part of the conversation, but I think there would need to be a lot of confidence gained that that missile would never find its way into Russian hands, because that is one of our most capable missiles. And there are lots of reports that some of the other technology that we've handed over to Ukraine has fallen into the hands of the Russians, and some of it's been given to the North Koreans and to the Iranians. That's not great. So I don't think it's as much about the integration, although that's really important. I think it's as much about how far is the West prepared to go with technology. 1992 is the most modern one that they're planning to give to Ukraine, but I believe that it's 1980s aircraft that you've currently got. It looks very modern. What was your mobile phone? Well, you're not old enough, but when in 86, you know, mobile phones were big bricks.
With large
aerials, you know, so although it flies, you know, the aircraft hasn't changed a lot. It's very powerful, it turns corners, 9G. I've flown in an F-16. It's an amazing aeroplane. In a way, that doesn't matter. What matters is how good its radar is. He who sees the enemy first wins. The better your radar, the earlier you see the enemy, before he sees you, the more you can throw something at him. Radars have changed enormously over the last 40 years. Electronic warfare, how do you manage that? The defensive aids of the aircraft, the way that it links your aircraft to other aircraft, all of that has changed. So some of the technology, it's a great leap forward for Ukraine, but it's still old technology. It's not new. And I think that's why sometimes people forget that. Now, I don't know what level of software that has been given to Ukraine, because we're less worried about that falling into Russian hands, because software can be destroyed when the aircraft or crashes or the missile crashes. The hardware we are very sensitive about, but the software, by giving Ukraine a better level of software than they might have had, is probably less risky than giving you the full missile. So the honest answer is, I know it's a long answer, but it's not just about the integration of Meteor. It's also about whether the West is happy for you to have it.
Okay, thank you so much. It's interesting view of this problem, because we discuss another things about Meteor and F-16. So, Air Vice-Marshal Sean Bean in Militarny. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure, and thanks for the hospitality. It's been a massive learning experience for me and a huge pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.